Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Kiangai AA Wash Processed Kenya from John Small Roastery. And there's the bag right there. And John Small, based out of Seoul, South Korea. And this is part 3 of our 7-part series featuring the 7 Korean coffees from our most recent blind taste test rankings video. And if you watched that video, then you saw that this coffee finished 5th place out of those 7 coffees on that day. And I actually got this one mixed up with the Kenyan coffee from Hocus Pocus. And I attribute that to a lack of familiarity with both of those 2 coffee roasters. But it always gives us an opportunity to compare and contrast the 2 Kenyan coffees by the end. So we will see how this one turned out. This right here is day 39. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this coffee. So among the Kenyan coffees we are reviewing in this series, this was one of the lighter ones that we had. So I would say that it's somewhat on par with the coffee that we had from Identity, and it's actually interestingly a little lighter feeling than the Aloe that we're also reviewing from John Small. And that's something we'll get into when we're discussing both of these coffees a little further. But even then, as I've mentioned in the past, none of these Korean coffees we're reviewing are particularly light by most standards. So I feel like the best way to align this one is a light medium in terms of the roast profile by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 15, first impression, and it was the blind taste test day, and the cup did have plenty of the expected Kenyan-like aspects with plenty of the red brightness and citric qualities present at the forefront of the cup. Outside of that, it was slightly cleaner with a little less of the savory red aspects to the cup as well. And once again, if you watched that video, then you saw that I was immediately able to pick this coffee out on that table as being one of the 2 Kenyan coffees. Both the Kenyan coffees on that table were very distinct, and mostly that was because of the brightness and also those savory attributes that you can expect from these Kenyan coffees. So pretty straightforward in that aspect. We move on to day 18 as we opted for the Chemex. And it was interesting because this coffee did feel notably better when it was isolated from the other coffees on that table, as there were plenty of the red berry bright aspects to the cup yet again, this time with a little bit more of a candied sweetness. And one thing I should mention is that John Small roasts on the Gießen, and I want to give credit to Airworks on that one because it is included on the card that Airworks includes for the coffees that they are featuring in their drops. So I saw that they used the Gießen, and that might have a little bit of an impact on this one because a lot of the coffees I've had roasted on the Gießen seem to offer a similar attribute in that sense. In addition to that, there's a slight bit of bitterness that's in line with the listed grapefruit, but other than that, a pretty nice day. Day 21 through the April brewer, and this was a much more moderate experience as the brightness continues to offer that classic Kenyan-like feel with more of that complementary citric bitterness. The cup itself, though, did seem to lose a little bit of its structure as it cooled down, and that's why I wasn't a particularly big fan of this one through the April brewer. And when we get into this coffee a little more, you'll kind of see that there's a little bit of a dynamic between this coffee off brew and when it finishes. But we'll get to that part later, as on day 24, we opted for the V60 with a slightly lower extraction adjustment, and there honestly wasn't too much of a change from a lot of the earlier experiences we had, as it was a little improved as the brightness felt a little better defined, which was kind of interesting to me. Outside of that, the listed black currant is quite prominent, with a caramelized sweetness a little bit more present in the finish, improved all around on this day. We move on to day 27 as we opted for the Chemex with the same adjustments, and it's offering some mixed results with a lingering bit of the candied sweetness in the background and plenty of the Kenyan-like brightness yet again. Overall, less defined flavor profile and a little less sweetness, so it did improve a little bit more as the cup cooled down, and once again, something we'll get into on the final day as we move on to day 30 through the V60 with our standard recipe. And this was the most notable deviation we had from some of the previous experiences of this coffee, as it does have a little bit more of the bitterness in the cup this time around. A slightly darker stone fruit plum-like attribute is also present with a caramelized finish to the cup. So while it's been mostly consistent, I would say that this one had just a little bit more bitterness, and in addition to that, an additional more plum-like attribute within it. Day 33 through the Chemex with our standard recipe, and once again, the coffee has been pretty consistent as off brew. It's offering plenty of the Kenyan-like characteristics with a notable bit of brightness. Outside of that, there was a slight preference towards the V60 as there's a little less sweetness when brewing it with the Chemex. And that's why on day 36, we opted for the V60 one last time. And it did have two relatively distinct layers to the cup, and that's what I've been kind of hinting towards right from the start, as it offers that more traditional Kenyan-like feel with the bright red berries, red florality, and notable savoriness, while the cool down offers a little bit more of a bitter aspect to it, a little bit more in line with that grapefruit that they have listed, also the candied aspect, and it still has that savoriness in the finish, so you do get a little bit of that at the forefront, and you do get much more of that in the finish as well. So the savoriness is an ever-present quality, as a lot of the expected Kenyan red tones. Nonetheless, it's been pretty straightforward and consistent, a lot of what you'd expect from a Kenyan coffee. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have quite a few level 4s, so let's go through them. And we'll start with the ones I always like to start with for Kenyan coffees, and that is the finish and the acidity. We'll talk about them side by side because those are attributes that I'm always really surprised if they don't reach that level 4 mark. And as far as I can recall, pretty much every single washed Kenyan that we've ever reviewed has reached at least a level 4 for both of those marks, and that is no exception with this one right here, as it definitely had a lingering, as I kind of mentioned, slightly savory finish to this one. It also has a candied and caramelized aspect. So you get a lot in the finish, and that's one of the better parts of this coffee, with the exception of the savoriness, which I will acknowledge a little bit more when we get to that part of this coffee. Sweetness, level 4. And that was a very interesting one because I said to myself, okay, it's probably on the higher side of level 3, lower side of level 4. But since I did kind of mark this one down a little bit for the cleanliness, I was like, okay, I'm going to be really nice in one aspect. I'm going to give it a higher mark for the sweetness since I'm giving it a lower mark for the cleanliness. So it's probably on the lower side of level 4. It does have some nice sweetness to it, candied and caramelized otherwise. But outside of that, I would say that, yeah, it is, I would say, at least notably sweeter than some of the other Kenyan coffees we've reviewed in the past. Florality, level 4, and there's no floral note listed on here, but this is pretty typical what I experience from Kenyan coffees in general. Definitely has a fair bit of that red florality, and given that there's an herbal tone to it as well, I could definitely see plenty of that hibiscus-like component, which is an ever-present quality in the vast majority of Kenyan coffees that we have. We'll move on to 2 level 4s for the fruit categories, and we'll start with the berry fruit level 4. Not really much to say on that one. We have plenty of those tart Kenyan berry aspects to this one. That's definitely notable, abundant, prominent, and present, consistent throughout within this coffee. And then the citrus fruit also scoring at that level 4. And that's something at times I do get with Kenyan coffees, and I was really mulling over whether or not I wanted to put it at a level 3. And when I first started sipping this coffee right after, I said, okay, citrus fruit, probably a little lower than I remember. Let's put it at the level 3. But then the more and more the coffee cooled down, the more and more I was experiencing that citric bitterness to it. And that's why I said, okay, by the end, let's bump that up to a level 4. So level 4 for both of them. I would say, given the layering of this coffee, you can experience both of them in abundance from time to time. All right, let's move on to level 3s, and we will actually start with the caramel level 3. It was interesting to me that caramel is one of the notes that they have listed on this coffee. I don't think I see that too often for Kenyan coffees. Even then, I could definitely see a fair bit of that, mostly in the finish. Not necessarily always the most detectable or pronounced quality within this one, as it definitely offers much more of the Kenyan-like components. But outside of that, it's experienced enough to justify that level 3 mark. And then we have the, we'll go into them. We'll go into the body next, level 3. And as I was brewing this one, I said, okay, classic, that Kenyan juicy body, and a little bit more medium textured in that regard. So that was definitely justified there. And I guess we'll go into the 2 big ones now. We'll start with the savoriness, level 3. So yes, it does have a slight bit of that tomato-like characteristic to it, mostly off brew. As I mentioned, there is that savory quality to it in the finish. I would say that that's a little bit more of that kind of black tea-like aspect to it, but there's enough of that savoriness in general, whether it be the red fruits, the berries, the tea-like component, or even that tomato-like, to justify that level 3 mark. And that's what causes the cleanliness to bump down to that level 3 mark. As I was really kind of thinking about the rest of this coffee, and I said there's enough definition to plenty of the other components to maybe justify that level 4. If it was maybe a little void of some of the, we'll say, hindering savory qualities, then it definitely would have justified itself at that level 4. But as I'd already mentioned, sweetness earned that level 4 at the cost of the clarity, and kind of vice versa. Honestly, both of them could have gone either way. I think I just felt a little bit more comfortable that the sweetness was closer to a 4 and the cleanliness was a little closer to a level 3 on this tasting wheel. And then I think final thing worth discussing is actually the bitterness, because when I was making this tasting wheel, I was making the bitter part of this tasting wheel first, right off brew, and I said, okay, it's really honestly not as bitter as I remember, but once again, as this cup cools down, you experience a little bit more of that, so that could be bumped up to the level 3 mark. But I would say, depending on when you're making this tasting wheel, when you're drinking this coffee. That could kind of vary over time. But outside of that, as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I did go into this one with some relatively high expectations, given that I'd heard a lot of positive things about John Small. And in addition to that, my favorite Kenyan coffees to review are the SL28 ones, the ones that are just purely SL28, or SL34, or the very interesting isolated Kenyan varietals from Colfea Circular as well. This one, on the other hand, though, I would say that with such high expectations and it turning out to be a little bit more Kenyan-like with the overall experience, then I could say that it was maybe not necessarily what I was looking for. I was maybe looking for a little bit more sweetness, a little less of that savory quality to it. But as far as this one goes relative to the other coffees, I would say that I enjoyed this one significantly more than the Hocus Pocus coffee. And I would say it's a distant fourth from the 7 coffees that we are reviewing in this series, as the 3 top coffees were a very distinct top 3. And obviously when we get to those coffees, then I'll kind of discuss them a little further in depth. But this one right here, it was definitely better than coffees 5, 6, 7 for me, but not quite as good as coffees 1, 2, 3 that we will discuss a little later. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. This one is your classic Kenyan coffee. It offers so many of those classic Kenyan attributes. I think the best thing I can highlight about this one is that it has a little bit more sweetness in general. And in addition to that, I've mentioned that the citric qualities aren't necessarily always the most abundant in Kenyan coffees. So if you do enjoy that slightly more bitter citric quality, most distinctly that grapefruit-like component, then this one's a really nice fit, as it continues to offer plenty of those Kenyan characteristics while offering something slightly different and a little bit more candied sweet of a sense. That's the best direction I can point somebody towards for this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Kiangai AA, wash processed Kenya from John Small Roastery. Thank you for watching.